Hi everyone, welcome to our channel. So this is part 6 of video series NestJS and Angular CRUD example. Now we are going to implement the update operation. Okay. For that we are going to add a edit button on each card. Okay. So on clicking edit button, we are going to show a update form in our Angular application. On submitting the update form, we have to create a update endpoint in our NestJS application so that on submitting form data can be posted to that update API. Okay, and along with update API, we need to create one HTTP GET endpoint in our NestJS application. So that GET endpoint returns the data by ID because in update form we have to display the record that we want to update, right? So for that we have to use that HTTP GET by ID. Okay, so first let's implement the logic at our NestJS application. Okay, so first let's try to implement the endpoint HTTP GET endpoint where we are going to give a response by ID. Okay, so for that first let's go to superhero service. Okay, here let's create one more method like async get by id. Okay, so this parameter will have input parameter like our id, which is a string. Okay, and from here I'm going to return this dot superhero model dot, okay, find by id. You can see the default method find by id that expects the id value as the input parameter, and you can call simple execute. Okay, so this query filters the document from the MongoDB collection based on the ID we passed. Okay, now let's consume this method into our new HTTP GET endpoint. So go to superhero controller. Let's create a sync. Okay, get by ID. Okay, and this should be a get request, right? At the rate get. And we have to define a route expression here. Okay, whatever expression we are giving here will be part of the URL. Okay, so here I want to add a dynamic expression. So to add a dynamic expression, we have to use colon and name of the variable. Okay, IDs. That means ID will be the part of the URL. Okay, and semi is colon in front of the ID represent it is a dynamic value. This can be any value. Okay, so to read this value into our action method. Okay, so we have to use decorator like param, and we have to specify the name, which type of dynamic variable I want to read, ID. Okay, and I can give a normal ID and it is a string. So param, what it will do, it searches for the ID placeholder value from the URL and it pushes into this variable. Okay, that is the use of the @param. So now I simply return this dot superhero service dot get by ID. Okay, so we are done with the get by ID endpoint. Okay, now let's implement one more endpoint, that is update endpoint. So to implement the update endpoint means we have to update a document in the MongoDB collection. For that, first write the logic for database interaction. Okay, so here one more method async update. Okay, and this method going to receive two parameter. One is the ID value, okay, document ID which we want to update, and another is the payload to update into the document. Okay, now here what I can do, I will simply return and await. This is also async. Please await it here. Okay. Now await this dot superhero model dot find by ID and update. So it's going to find by ID to find the document and update the document. So it expects few parameters like document ID and payload to update. Okay. And next, one more parameter options I can give like new. Okay, true. So what is this new true means? Okay, by default, the find by ID update will return uh, the document data before updated. Okay, so to get the data after updated, you should pass option like new colon true. Okay, now let's create the HTTP put endpoint. For update, we have to use the verb HTTP put so that only HTTP put request can execute our endpoints. Okay. So let me create the new endpoint here. Async. Okay. Async update superheroes. My method name. And it should be the at the rate put decorator. That means only HTTP put request uh, can execute this method or access this method, and this at the rate put comes from the NestJS common. Okay, and here we are going to give the dynamic URL part, that is our ID. We know dynamic prefixed with colon and the ID. Okay, we know how to read the ID value, right? So at the rate param decorator and name of the dynamic replace holder ID and ID string. And remaining form data or document data we have to update. We read it from the body because those are form data, right? At the rate body. Okay. Superheroes, heroes type. Okay. Now let's use our update method in our service. Await this dot superhero service dot update and pass our ID and superheroes data. Okay. So that's our endpoint. Okay. Now let's rerun our API project. Okay, here you can see the new routes of our action methods are displaying for HTTP get by ID and HTTP put action methods are generated. Okay, so now we are done with the logic at our NestJS application. Let's get back to our Angular application. Okay, so we have to display the update form, right? For that, we will create a new component. Okay, so ng generate component. I want it inside of the superheroes folder, right? Superheroes and edit hyphen super hyphen heroes. This is my component name. I don't want any spec files. Keep yes. Okay, run it. Okay, here our component got created. Let's check it. Okay, inside of the superheroes folder, and here is our edit superheroes component. Okay. So first let's configure the edit superheroes component, our new component routing. For that, go to app routing module. Okay. And here we have to define the path to our component. Okay. So path edit superhero, and along with the static URL, here our path should contain the dynamic part. Okay, because our ID. See that whichever item we want to edit, that record ID should be in the URL so that we can use that ID in our edit component. Okay, so that means ID value will be a dynamic, right? So to define the dynamic content, Just like NestJS, we can use same in Angular. So semicolon and ID. So here ID is the dynamic replaceable content, any value. It doesn't matter for the Angular, any value it will come. But we have to read it in our edit component and also map the component. Right? So we are good. We have mapped our edit routing. Now let's go to our superhero service in the Angular project, and let's implement for logic to invoking the HTTP get endpoint by ID and also the update endpoint. Okay, so first get by ID. Okay, it's going to receive the ID as input parameter. Okay, return this dot HTTP get. Okay, since here we have to add the dynamic URL, right? We have to use backticks. Okay, and copy our endpoint. Okay, and slash dollar and open the flower bracket. So within this flower brackets, we can push our dynamic content. So ID I have to push. Okay, so that's going to return the single superhero by ID. Okay, so that is our get by ID endpoint. Now let's also define the update endpoint. So I'm going to name the method like update. Okay, and it should contains ID and also the superhero content. So which is of our type creator update hero type. Okay, and return, since it is the update, right? So that means put request. So this dot http dot put. Okay, and to this put I can copy this URL because ID value should be within the URL, and then comma I have to pass one more parameter, that is nothing but payload, which is our superhero model. Okay, so these are our two endpoints logic in our Angular application. Okay, so now let's go to our edit component PS file. We have to read the ID of the record in the URL. Okay, to read it, we have to inject the activated route service. So inside of the constructor, so name it like route, and service will be activated route. Okay, using this activated route service, I can read the URL contains ID value. Okay, so to read it, I'm going to use it in the ng unit because on component rendering, we are depending on the ID value. So let's read it. So this dot route dot param map. So it is a observable. Subscribe to this param map. Okay, and params any variable name. Okay, so in this subscription, we have to read the param. So params dot get and specify the URL parameter. So this parameter name must be equivalent to the uh, dynamic value placeholder we have defined in our route. So go to app routing module. Here we have added the placeholder, right? ID. Copy that name. Okay, and pass it here. So Angular can read the this placeholder value from the URL, and we have to store it in the variable. So I'm going to create a variable here, item ID, visually empty. So let's assign to this red warning line. So here red warning line specifying that our string we define string, but param may give null value. So to overcome this error, double quotations and give the empty. That means if this returns null value, then assign this empty value to this variable. Okay. So now let's invoke the get API call. Okay, get by ID we have defined in our service, right? Let's consume this endpoint. So let me create a method here, get by ID, and let's inject the service. So private superheroes service, okay, and we can consume now this dot superheroes. Sorry, name it like superheroes service, okay. Superhero service dot get by ID. To this we have to pass the item ID that we want to edit. Okay, and let's subscribe it. So it's going to return the data from the server that we requested record. Okay. Now we have to bind the data from the API call to our form. Till now we haven't defined any edit form, right? So let me go to add TS component. Okay. If you recall, the superheroes object is the model for binding to our form, right? So just copy this entire object, okay, and paste it over here. So here also this is my form model, okay. So import the namespace, and now let's map the server data to my form model, okay. So superheroes dot franchise equal to data dot franchise. This dot superheroes dot image URL equal to data dot image URL. This dot superheroes dot name equal to data dot name. This dot superheroes dot powers equal to data dot powers. So that is the response mapping, right? Now let's add the form in our HTML. That form uses this model binding for reading or updating the form. For that, we simply copy the form from the add superheroes HTML, okay, to save some time. So go to edit superheroes.html, paste it over here. Let's do some changes. So change it like update heading, and here we are mapping the superheroes model name, okay, and franchise, just like same object we are using in the edit form also, right? So there won't be any changes in the HTML mostly. And for now, let me remove the click event for the this should be update, okay. And now let's run and check whether we are able to populate the item that we want to edit on the form, okay. But to check, we need to have a edit button here, right? For every code, individual code, it must contains the edit button. So first let's define that edit button. For that, let me go to all superheroes component.html, and here I am going to add one more card body, okay. So div. Now here I am going to add the button. For editing, I have to navigate to another page, right? So instead of button, I am going to use the anchor tag, but I am going to apply the button styles. Okay. So anchor tag, edit, and we want button styles, right? So btn primary. Okay. And we know router link we have to use Angular attribute for navigating the another component without page loading, right? But here we are going to wrap it around square braces router link, and so that I can create the dynamic URL. If there is no dynamic URL, that if it is a static, then we simply remove router link. If you recall, for add button, we have directly added, right? It is a simple string, right? So we didn't added any square brackets around the router link. Since now we have to define the dynamic route, because dynamically we have to append the item to item ID in the URL. Okay. So first part will be our part of the routing. Okay. So single quotes. So go to app routing module. Just copy this edit superhero string. Okay. And go to all superheroes component and paste it. And second parameter, I can pass my dynamic value. Like this array of items should be passed here. So automatically URL will be generated by the Angular. So here second value is ID, right? Because here ID is a dynamic value, right? So for that I have to pass it here. So item dot underscore ID. Now once it is rendered, it is generated like slash edit superhero slash ID value. Okay. Now test it. Now here we have edit button, right? Let me click on edit so that I have to navigate back to my edit form. And also we are invoking the API call, right? And one more change I forgot to add. Go to edit component.ts. I have created this get by ID, but I am not invoking it. So it should be invoked here itself. Okay, this dot get by ID. So once we reading the ID, we are invoking the API call. Okay. Now let's go to our website. Go to network calls. Okay. Clear them. Click on edit button. See, I am able to land on update form, and in the URL you can see ID value that we want to edit. Okay, and here see entire data is populated. And if you go to network call, this is our network call get by ID API call invoking. And if you observe the preview response preview, this one. So we are successfully populating our edit form with the item that we want to edit. Okay. Now on updating, we have to save the data back to our Mongo database, right? And then we must go back to our home page. Okay. For that, in edit component, I will create a one more method like update. Okay. Update. And we know in our service, we have defined our update API call, right? So ID and our payload form payload must be sent to the API. So for that, let's go to edit component. So this dot superhero service dot update and pass this dot item ID comma this dot superhero form model directly I can pass and subscribe to it. On successful response, I want to navigate back to my home page. So for that, we have to inject one more Angular service, that is private router, name it like router, and service is router. So that also loads from the Angular routing. Okay. So now using the router service, I can navigate back to my home page. This dot router dot navigate, okay, and open circular braces. Inside of it, pass the array and define the path. Since it is a home path, right? Simple slash is enough. Okay. And register this update method with the update click event, button click event. So here. So we know that click must be registered like this. Okay. Now let's test this as well. Let's clear everything. Click on edit button. We got data API call, get by ID API call invoked, and let me update the superpowers to not available. Okay, and click on update. See, I have navigate back to home page, and this is the updated value. And if you go to here, see, This is my put method, nothing but the update method. Payload. This is my payload that is populated from my form, edit form. It is posted to the server and it is successfully saved. Okay. If you have any doubts, if you refresh, content must be come from API, right? See, that means update is successful. Okay. Next, we are going to implement the delete operation. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope this video delivered some useful content to you all. If you like the video, please do support me by subscribing to my channel. Soon we are going to meet with new content. Until then, signing off.